So let's start with the most obvious perception, which is that people will adopt it on their own. We know this is not true. You know, the build it, they will come approach does not work, especially with SharePoint. For years now, we've seen that. And then when you take a solution on SharePoint, like an intranet, or you take a solution like an extranet, team collaboration sites, etc., you run into a very similar pattern. This is also really important because in many cases with Office 365, we are changing the way people work. We're encouraging them to work differently. So instead of using Outlook for everything, you know, try and use this tool, try and use that tool. And so again, that change means that people need to, even if it's minor changes, they need to change how they work. And so that kind of change just does not happen effectively. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen effectively on its own. So we want to steer that change. We want to be a part of it. We want to drive that change. And the example here, and there's a number of these in the industry, but the example here is that there have been real studies, and I'm not going to go through the whole scenario, but there's real studies out there that have basically proven, even when it's life or death, we as people don't effectively change. What we need is we need a little bit of direction. We need a little bit of guidance, and we need a little bit of follow-up, right? The coaching almost model. And there are ways to scale that, and we'll talk about that within the organization. But I think the realization here is that IT has to understand at a baseline, and whether it's IT or leadership, that this change does require some level of commitment and engagement from the organization. And we'll talk about IT's commitments in a moment. So the second question that often comes up around that is, well, you know, driving usage, driving, you know, active usage, that's not really IT's problem. IT is responsible for making sure that the technology is available to people, that it's implemented effectively, right? That it's running and performing really well. And that's potentially true in a historic view of IT. But the reality is, in today's world, it's IT's responsibility to drive adoption as well, right? It's not just the organization's issue. In other words, successful implementation is necessary, but it's not sufficient on its own. So when you think about getting more people to use the technology at a first level, right? So just getting, it's often called like active usage, getting people to use it in an active state. That is a first step. That's kind of foundational. So IT should be measuring and trying to drive active usage. They should be trying to get people to use the technology. And in many cases, some technologies have a really good level of usage, right? Exchange Online and Outlook, if you're talking about Office 365, tend to be very heavily used by most employees. And when we look at something like that, it may indicate, oh, well, our kind of work is done in that category from an IT perspective. And again, I want to challenge that that's not true. So not only does IT need to drive usage and get people to be aware, to help with this process, because IT, remember, has implemented these technologies based on the promise of value, right? So you've made investments as IT in these technologies to empower the organization, but it's on the promise of value. That value is only realized when people are using the technology. So again, usage as a minimum is important. But then better usage is also critical. So take Outlook and Exchange. Think about all those times that you've looked at your own usage of Outlook and learned, hey, there's a button that you just didn't know what it did before. Now you use it all the time. As an example, when I do a message to a larger group of people, I often use the do not reply all functionality within Outlook to ensure people can't do reply all messages as a leader within my organization. And so that kind of functionality is a simple feature that's been around for years in Outlook, but is something that, you know, only a few years ago I learned that I could do it, and I've been using it ever since. So there's sort of advanced features in Outlook, especially in SharePoint, in Yammer, and all these other spaces where there's more that we can do. So it's not just the basic usage, consumption, or you know, viewing information, or maybe in OneDrive case, you know, just using OneDrive, but sharing files and doing things like looking at the reporting and usage on which files are more popular. Again, taking it further than just using the technology, that's IT's responsibility. And it's an important responsibility because if IT doesn't do it, then they're going to lose credibility, trust, and value within the enterprise over time, right? Those organizations that have transitioned to a services-focused IT organization, they've already started to adapt to this kind of model. And so ask yourself, if you're a IT pro or a dev or something like that, do I understand my impact on driving more effective usage? If it's a developer, you're building great solutions, and that's driving people towards it. If you're an IT pro, then you should be figuring out, how can I take the reporting and other data and share that more effectively? I want to also touch upon something really quickly here, which is another false perception, which is that, one, we don't want to have a negative impact on people's work, so we don't want to necessarily introduce a lot of these changes, or we want to defer or delay a change. Now, it is true with any new technology, especially in the productivity space, so Office 365, SharePoint, all these things fit within this category, you are going to see a dip in productivity. Now that dip is because people are learning how to do things in a different way. Instead of using file shares, now I'm learning how to use SharePoint or OneDrive for Business. And so there is a small negative consequence impact here, right? Where I'm just not as fast, I'm not as efficient, I'm not as effective at doing it. But that tends to be a very short period of time. And then I get into, I'm more productive in this environment because unlike the file shares, I can access those from anywhere. It actually gives visibility because when I store my data in OneDrive or SharePoint with Delve, it's discoverable by other people. So there's all sorts of other perks and benefits that are coming along with this simple change. And the key here is what we can do as IT is we can help manage that change. Now, I'm not saying you need to coach every individual user, but there are things that we can do, like providing training opportunities, providing pilots, and other things like that to reduce the risk of negative consequences causing the user to transition back to a legacy or alternative technology. So let me give you an example. If I'm training and learning a new technology as a user and I'm doing it during training, that's a place where it's okay to be less productive. Right? It's okay to have an impact on my productivity. And so in that scenario, training is kind of making this a safe area so it doesn't have the same type of negative potential impact where someone says, oh, if this is just too much work, I'm going to switch back to the old model. Because by the end of that training, they're already on this upward curve. That would be one example of a potential goal. Another thing to consider is that we can accelerate this change. So if we do things like, and I'll talk about it later, awareness campaigns, and we do other things as IT to help educate and inform the organization, often we can actually accelerate how quickly people get to the positive impact from these changes. And so if we can do that, there's substantial ROI and other factors to consider here. Is that a question? Oh, looks like just maybe an audio accident there. So the other thing to note is I have heard this many times from other IT organizations. Well, we'll just do it at a later time. We don't need to prioritize it now. There's millions of other things that we need to do first. And what I would suggest there is you just want to make sure you understand where your industry is and where your organization is from an IT perspective, especially when it comes to these patterns of productivity and collaboration. And you want a real outside opinion on this often because your internal opinion might be biased. You might think you have a much stronger competitive advantage when it comes to technology than maybe you do. And so looking at that, if you're far behind the rest of the world, you are putting your organization at a competitive disadvantage due to the technology. Your productivity is not going to be as high, and the tools that people are going to use when you have a larger and larger gap tend to be alternative or unsanctioned tools. They start to use Dropbox, they start to use these other tools that maybe you never wanted to have within IT, but now you have to support. And now you have even more change management because you're not just transitioning people from legacy or traditional methods to new methods, but you're also transitioning them from modern tools to a different modern tool that you'd rather them use for governance and a variety of other IT reasons.